Welcome to Berlin. Welcome to Berlin Briefing. My name is Max Hofmann. And if you're watching us in the United States, you might be asking yourself, are we still friends with Germany? What is the relationship status almost 3 weeks into the Iran war? And that's something we can discuss and we will discuss today. And I have great guests. I have Sudha David-Wilp on my side from the German Marshall Fund. And she is one of the biggest experts on transatlantic ties, transatlantic relationships in Berlin. So thanks for being with us. On my left, Michaela Küfner, who is my colleague here and also an expert, our go-to person for the German Chancellor. She was in the Oval Office, what was it, 2.5 weeks ago? Right?
Yeah, it feels like months ago, but yes.
Only 2.5 weeks ago. So right after the Iran war started. And we also have my colleague Teri Schultz in Brussels. So if you ever have a question about NATO, then Teri is the one to call here. And that'll come in very, very handy in our discussion today. So thank you, everybody, for being with us. And I would like to start kind of with a flashback. You said it seems like ages, and that's true if you listen to this soundbite from the U.S. President Donald Trump in the Oval Office when he was with the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. Let's take a listen.
I have a meeting with a man who's become a friend of mine, and we've known each other for a little while in some very interesting times, and we get along. Our countries get along very well. We have a great affinity for each other.
Yeah, you were in that room, Michaela, and what would you say was the relationship status back then?
Well, clearly, Friedrich Merz's, I'd say, biggest foreign policy success since he came into office now 10 months ago is that he managed to establish a kind of rapport and that clearly Donald Trump respects him. But this was 2 weeks ago now, and things changed quickly. The U.S. president was in the midst of launching that campaign against Iran together with Israel.
It had been a couple of days that it had started, right?
Yeah, it had just started, and the assumption on the American side was that this would be a very fast exercise. And there was already criticism also in that room of Britain, of Spain, and not being fast enough to open their bases to that campaign. There was the assumption on the US side, whatever Donald Trump decides to do, the Europeans are going to be with him. But there was also an assumption that he doesn't need his European allies, that he doesn't need Germany. And that became very clear when Friedrich Merz also decided not to defend Spain in the room when it took some heat. Donald Trump declaring that he would stop trade with Spain, which of course didn't happen because it's an EU issue. And also this was just over 24 hours after Friedrich Merz spoke of a dilemma in terms of international law over that attack that was launched by Israel and the US on Iran. He said he would not lecture his partners.
Hang on a sec. We got that soundbite that we're going to listen to later and going to talk about, obviously, also the evolving relationship there. But I just want to know from you, if you had to describe that status, I thought about that. What would you describe it like in kind of Facebook terms or social media terms? Would you agree with back then Germany and the US were friends with economic benefits, for example? Would that work for you?
They were and actually still are allies tied to each other. And there was not a bromance, but a buddy kind of friendship as far as friendship goes in the political sphere, because Friedrich Merz has also on the record said there is no such thing as friendship in politics.
Okay.
But that's as far as it goes for Friedrich Merz. But there's also a clear dependency. So as friendly as two leaders can be when one is clearly more dependent on the other.
Sudha.
Max.
Yes. Thank you. No, actually, I was going to ask you, would you classify what the German Chancellor Merz was doing with Donald Trump as appeasement?
So I think appeasement is definitely a strategy that Europe and Germany has taken vis-a-vis the White House, but accommodation is not going to work all the time. I think there are certain topics like Greenland and Iran where Europe and Germany have said enough is enough. We need to set our red lines, and we need to act as a unified actor or a unified body. That's always not so easy, but I think appeasement is necessary as kind of the default, because as Michaela mentioned, Europe is still dependent on the United States for security and also for trade. And frankly, the U.S. also needs Europe. I mean, it's quite interesting that President Trump went from "we don't need your help" to suddenly we'd like our partners like the U.K. and France to help with unlocking and securing the Strait of Hormuz. So there's definitely been a change in that sense. But getting back to your initial question, the times of Germany being the indispensable partner are over. But at the same time, there is a recognition that Germany is an important pillar for the European security architecture. This country has undergone major transformation in the last 4 years. So Zeitenwende has definitely happened, and that's registered in Washington. But the whole issue about Zeitenwende with the United States, I think, is still unfolding.
Okay. Now let's listen to that soundbite, to that quote that you referred to, Michaela, and then I'll come over to you, Teri.
Condemning Iran's violations of the law and even imposing extensive packages of sanctions have had little effect over the years and decades. This is also because we were not prepared to enforce fundamental interests with military force if necessary. Therefore, now is not the time to lecture our partners and allies. Despite all our doubts, we share many of their goals without being able to actually achieve them ourselves.
So no lecturing, says the German Chancellor. Teri, when you, as a NATO expert, hear what Merz said there, what do you make of it?
Well, this was after, of course, the allies had already tried to encourage the U.S. to go back to diplomacy after those surprise initial strikes. The E3, those three European countries, the U.K., Germany, and France, who had helped negotiate the Iran nuclear deal, put out a statement saying, basically, okay, let's go back to trying to talk to Iran. In the early days, they very much hoped it would be true what Trump said, that this was going to be quick and it was going to be wrapped up. Certainly, I don't think everyone expected the amount of damage that Iran would inflict in retaliation. And I think now the Europeans are very much stuck. As you say, they don't want to come out too strongly against President Trump, but it was really stark on Monday when we had a Foreign Affairs Council here in town, and they were going to discuss who might be willing to send possibly some ships, possibly change the mandate of an EU naval mission to move up into the Strait of Hormuz just for escorts. Nobody stood up. Nobody went forward. And Kaja Kallas had to come out and say, you look, there's no appetite to basically help the U.S. here, even in self-interest. So I don't think President Trump has found much favor here. Even those countries that are friendly to him, like the UK, which offered ships, which, as you mentioned, he said, keep your ships, we don't need them. And then basically overnight said, oh, why aren't they here already? And just to hear Pete Hegseth yesterday call the European partners ungrateful allies, it's very clear that Washington is very, very angry. At the same time, they haven't sent out clear and consistent signals. So I don't know how they could really expect Europeans to behave differently, even if they wanted to, which Friedrich Merz initially seemed like he did want to.
Let's stick with that just 1 second, because I'm sure some of our viewers are looking at this and say the economic interests of Europe are also, very much affected. And even if they didn't want this war to happen, maybe they should try to support the United States in securing the Strait of Hormuz. That could be a reasoning. Teri, walk us through why this isn't that easy with NATO, why NATO can't just say, okay, let's go.
Well, technically, NATO could. It has had naval operations in the past, focused on piracy, for example, and that's where the EU naval mission is at the moment. And to be honest, people often confuse what NATO and the EU can do, and at the moment, it's the EU that has a mission there, that has ships in the region, and people shouldn't forget that 23 of the EU members are in NATO, and they've only got the same ships for either organization. So, and they don't have a lot. I mean, we're not talking about countries having just random ships sitting by the sidelines ready to go. Nobody even has minesweeping ships or minesweeping drones that they'd be willing to deploy. And I think as the fuel crisis hits nations independently, I mean, maybe there will be a rethink about what they could do in terms of non-aggressive help. But, once they put a ship in the Strait of Hormuz and it gets hit, they're involved, and nobody wants to go that far, and populations don't want to go that far. So you can't blame leaders for saying, I don't really want to go against my population in making a decision for President Trump.
But Michaela, why is the German government then always saying we can't participate because there's not even a mandate?
Because there is no mandate, but but I think it's important to note that the unusual united message coming out of the EU is, look, this is not our war. And that Donald Trump clearly underestimated what launching this mission will actually mean. And now we're in the stage where it's getting very messy. And not just in the region, where clearly Israel was now pushed to say that it took a unilateral decision to attack those gas facilities of Iran, which is a major escalation, which led to direct attacks on Qatar, which is a key ally of the US, but also a main supplier for gas also for Europe. So it's becoming more and more a strategic issue. And the Europeans made a point also at the summit, and Friedrich Merz clearly drew that line, saying we will not engage in this war, but once the war is over, the hot fighting is over, yes, we see ourselves in a situation where we need to discuss, and he always has to talk very carefully here because he does need a mandate from the German parliament. He needs a majority in parliament, so he can't just pledge German troops anywhere. But as far as the German chancellor can go, he says, we will be part of securing the Strait of Hormuz, but only once this war is over. But we're still in this very messy situation. And the forces to watch now are the plummeting share prices across the board in the US and here, where Americans are suddenly seeing their investments, their pensions go downhill, and at the same time, the rising gas prices.
Sudha, don't in the States, do people think that, I'm sorry if I'm getting back to that mandate question, maybe it's just a thing for me, but just let me know, isn't the feeling in the States that Europeans, especially Germans, are kind of hiding behind that? Say there's no mandate, we're nothing official. It's kind of bureaucratic, hiding behind it, and not just basically not wanting to do anything.
I think the U.S. electorate is also not necessarily supportive of this military action. The majority of Americans, of course, see Iran, the regime, as a threat and as an enemy, as does, I think, policymakers here in Berlin. I mean, this is why Chancellor Merz did say that this is not the time to lecture, right? Iran doesn't really respect international law either. But the issue is, what is the objective? What's the exit strategy? And these have been issues that all Europeans have been asking, and they don't want to get involved in a war where they're also their electorates are not in favor of this. But Europe, on the other hand, can't afford to sit it out, right? Europe does need to get somewhat involved because this is the immediate security neighborhood of Europe. And issues like whether energy costs or migration flows or even potential terrorism, this will affect Europe. The security spillover effects are pertinent to Europe. So Europe can't really afford to say, oh, we'll just kind of wait it out. But I think the easy sort of answer is to say, we're involved, we want to help shape, but when the kinetic action is over.
Okay. Let's
if
listen to
I can just bring up one more point,
Teri.
Max. Oh, sorry. One thing we haven't mentioned that's really important, and that is if one of these missiles, like the 4 that have headed into Turkey, actually hits in Turkey, the NATO country closest there, or perhaps on the EU side in Cyprus, where there are UK bases, or even in one of the other Gulf states where, for example, France has bases. If one of these missiles hits there and there are casualties other than U.S. casualties, and if it's a NATO country, for example, Turkey is the most likely one, calls Article 4 consultations, which is one step away from Article 5, then NATO doesn't have a choice, and an ally can call NATO into involvement, should we say? And it's been close. 4 times the NATO air defenses, U.S. have knocked a missile out of the sky before it hit Turkey, but that's a razor's edge.
And I think because we're on the topic of when NATO gets involved or not, and also the United States saying that NATO never helped the United States, that, of course, as we all know here, is not true, because the U.S. did invoke Article 5 after 9/11, and the Europeans did answer the call when it came to Afghanistan.
Yes. And if I could also mention, Max, I think it's important to discern the attitude of the White House and certain voices like Senator Lindsey Graham versus other members of Congress who wholeheartedly see the value of NATO. I think on the Senate side, there is recognition that, how much of a beating can allies take? And they also realize that when it comes to Ukraine, Europe and Germany particularly, they have stepped up. The U.S. is not really involved. Of course, it is in terms of intelligence sharing and support, but Europe is actually shouldering most of the burden when it comes to support for Ukraine now.
Let's bring it back to Germany a bit right here, because this is Berlin Briefing, and I would like to play another soundbite from Friedrich Merz. Now, remember what we just saw, the first one, where he said, we're not going to lecture anyone. And this is what the German chancellor sounded like this week, multiple occasions, but this was probably the strongest soundbite at the beginning of the week.
I want to remind everyone that on the first day of the war, President Macron, Prime Minister Starmer and I stated, like the United States and Israel, we want an end to Iran's nuclear and missile program. But we are not taking part in this war. We have said that from day one. And that remains the position of the government. But that also means, as long as the war continues, we will not take part in military means to ensure free navigation in the Strait of Hormuz.
There are 2 things here. To me, this sounds like a significant change to what he said at the Oval Office where you were, Michaela. But he's trying to say, basically, we've always said it this way. So which part is true here?
Neither, actually. And he actually went a bit further, addressing Parliament. He said he would have advised, if we weren't asked, if we had been asked, we would have advised against this war on Iran. So what he did, and he's done this several times over in respect to the United States now, is say as little as possible. I'd say in the old days, a German chancellor would have been expected to judge whether this was in accordance with international law. And he clearly took a conscious decision to sit on the fence in direct response to that attack being launched. Now he, like any leader, is also trapped by public opinion. Almost 2/3 of Germans are against this war. I actually think it's surprisingly low. My guesstimate would have been higher, frankly. And he now, of course, coordinated with European leaders, has the backing there. The Europeans have an unusually united stance. This is not our war. And he is trying to remain at the side of Trump as far as he can, but without any direct involvement of German troops or the Europeans as a whole. He's bound by the German constitution, nothing less than that, because he would need to get a mandate in the German Bundestag. And he's in a coalition with the Social Democrats, who, if anything, are trying very hard to remain as silent as possible, not being more critical of Donald Trump. So he was hyper pragmatic. And I just want to take us 1 year back when the US attacked the nuclear sites in Iran. It was the German government, and Merz let his foreign minister appeal until the last moment for de-escalation. Then it happened. And the Monday after, he was here in Berlin and basically moving on. He was just saying, the hope is that this will lead to a better future in the region, something along those lines. He just dropped the issue. And that's what he tried to do here. And he couldn't because he was in the Oval Office. And there was an expectation for him to take a position. And he's took as flexible a position as possible. So for me, this is pure pragmatism. There is no policy turnaround here.
Hyper-pragmatism, you said. We'll remember that for the future. Do you think those finer points of how the Germans are trying to maintain the relationship with the United States are understood in the White House?
Well, I think the White House knows that Germans and Europeans are stuck between a rock and a hard place because, as Michaela mentioned, popular opinion is not for this operation in the Middle East. But more importantly, I think maybe like 15% of Germans see the United States as a trusted ally right now. And that is really significant.
But less than who trust Russia. That's the intriguing thing.
Right. But the point is that Berlin can't afford to cut ties with Washington because of the biggest land wars operating in Europe right now.
That's clear, but we're trying to kind of figure out where the relationship is right now between the U.S. and Germany. And the Germans are trying, apparently, to maintain that relationship in a very difficult environment, but it appears that for the U.S. president, the only thing that counts is, are you with me or against me? And would you agree in saying that right now the Germans are going more towards the side of, you're not with me, so you're against me?
Well, no, because again, I think you have to dissect popular opinion with what policymakers need to do. No, Germany is very much recognizes that the United States still plays a foundational relationship with Germany. That the United States is foundational to Germany today, and it's not easy to sever those ties. And I think you've seen the Merkel beer tent speech talking about we need to take fate in our own hands and be our own sort of have agency, to now Chancellor Merz, who I think is crestfallen about this situation because he genuinely is a transatlanticist, but he sees that this is not the same relationship that was
he grew up with.
He grew up with, exactly. Yeah. And I think his speech at the Munich Security Conference really said it well about Germany needs to find this balance of principled realism, right? Where can we be realistic with our foreign and security policy and still maintain our principles? And that, I think, is the fine line that he's trying to walk. And for him and for Germany today and Europe, the United States is still an important partner, regardless of President Trump's diatribes in the White House. And we don't know what happens behind closed doors, because I do believe that Chancellor Merz did speak up for Starmer and for Sanchez after that press conference.
He did, and he did say it publicly afterwards, but he did not want to have a showdown in the Oval Office. Again, that probably was a very pragmatic decision.
Right, hyper-pragmatism, yes. Hyper-pragmatism. I got it. But I got one more soundbite, because to kind of highlight how this relationship has evolved over the last 2 weeks, and this one is from the U.S. president.
I think NATO's making a very foolish mistake, and I've long said that I wonder whether or not NATO would ever be there for us. So this was a great test, because we don't need them, but they should have been there. The other thing is, and I think very important, we didn't have to be there for Ukraine. Biden chose to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on Ukraine, and I guess the head of Germany just made a statement that, they weren't involved and they have nothing to do with the war.
Hey, Teri, over to you in Brussels. What do you think? Do you threaten allies like that? That's a threat, right?
Well, I mean, it's first of all, it's complete disinformation to say that the allies weren't there for him. You've already mentioned it. Allies individually remind President Trump that, yes, in fact, the only time you ever did ask us for something, we were there. And, this has really been hurtful. I can't even tell you how hurtful it was. In fact, for DW, I went to Denmark and talked to some of the service members.
Hurtful for whom?
The highest casualty.
Sorry, hurtful for whom, Teri?
For the allies, that President Trump keeps lying about this. It's we can't call it anything else. Disinformation that the allies were not there for the United States. So it's just a lie. It makes them feel like the service and the loss of lives in these countries, and there was significant in Denmark, for example, it is useless, and it really hurts things. It really hurts continuing ties. And let me just share a little snapshot from last night at the summit. One of the biggest things that was being talked about was not even what was happening there, as important as it was. It was this story that broke while we were all sitting there at the summit out of Denmark, that Greenland had actually Danish soldiers had been sent to Greenland with explosives to possibly blow up the runway if the U.S. invasion really happened. They had blood banks. There were planes on standby to evacuate people from Greenland. Things like this just tear apart the fabric of the foundation of NATO. And, I don't know if it can ever be fully repaired. And that's, Germany is part of that. And one thing about the German response, following on what Michaela said, they've been very careful to keep their friends by their sides. A statement that came out last night, independent of the EU summit, was, and I think you mentioned it already, Michaela, that Germany, and it was also signed by France, the Netherlands, Italy, the UK, said that they will be ready to help in the Strait of Hormuz when conditions are appropriate. And they did not state specifically in that statement that means when hostilities are over. But of course, all the leaders involved were asked later in their press conferences, and they all made clear again, that means when the fighting is over. They're not willing to go in, but they're not doing this completely independently. They are coordinating so that anybody who has military might that could be useful, France, Germany, are sticking together. And I agree with Michaela. The unity on that has been remarkable.
Yeah, but I have to put this into the context of the disunity over Ukraine, where Europeans, because of particularly Viktor Orban of Hungary, but also Slovakia, failed to get that 90 billion loan across the finishing line. So they managed to shoot themselves in the foot and increase their dependency even on the US, when really they want, at the same time, they try to take a stance and be united that they would only support defending the Strait of Hormuz once the fighting is over. So this is really I think this epitomizes the problems that the Europeans have both with the US, but also with themselves when they're called upon to be united.
Point taken, and definitely a topic in itself, maybe for another edition of Berlin Briefing. I would like to go back to something Teri said, where she said, I don't know, this is, Teri, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said something like, this is tearing at the fabric of NATO, and I don't know if it can ever be repaired.
Completely, yep.
Yep, that's it, right? Okay, so you have so much insight into what's happening behind the scenes of the German government. Are German politicians hoping that we will be able to go back to relations like they were before Trump, or are they really in earnest preparing for a completely different relation with the United States?
Well, hope has failed as a strategy. I think the Europeans have recognized that. Donald Trump has 2.5 more years to go. So it's a bit early to talk about, and we know what's happened in the past almost 1.5 years. So it's a bit early to be thinking post-Donald Trump. The working assumption here is that anyone just below the level of Pete Hegseth, who's now the Secretary of War, not just of Defense anymore in the US, understands the value of NATO also to the United States. But that does not stop Donald Trump from throwing it into doubt time and time again and throwing his political ability around.
So that has failed, hope. But what are the Germans doing? behind the scenes? How are they preparing?
Well, I mean, Germany has issued a blank check to defense spending. That's what the Germans are doing. They are trying to organize, and I stress trying to organize, a bolstering in European capabilities, although one has to say a key project between Germany and France is just before failing, the FCAS system, an interconnected air defense system, which was supposed to be kind of a model of European cooperation. So the bottom line is that the recognition is growing that the Europeans need to get their act together. And the key task for the Germans is, and always was for decades, to get the Europeans united and behind something. And that is why, particularly that decision or yesterday, or the inability to organize support for Ukraine, or give Ukraine the security for the next 2 years, at least financially, hits so hard back home. So I spoke to several people off the record, and they were saying part of the strategy is to keep adapting the strategy.
Okay,
that's.
But they've understood, and they're not. You don't see those people that say, "Let's just sit this out, and then we'll go back to default."
Nobody. No.
Okay.
This is, and I think this is also a major change that we're seeing this year, that we also saw at the Munich Security Conference. Nobody's talking about wake-up calls, whatever. Like everybody, this was what Greenland did to the relationship.
Right.
Is to recognize, and I'll stay in the relationship terms, it's an abusive relationship. To recognize that that's what it is, and to draw your own conclusions and get more independent where you can. On every front you can. We heard that from Friedrich Merz also ahead of this summit, saying we need to we need to leverage our power. It's not just one way. He meant the United States. He didn't say it directly. But then when you look at the details, it falls flat, because it still falls flat. But the ambition is now there to no longer be so trapped in a relationship as they currently are with the United States.
So abusive relationship, Michaela says, but we're staying together for the kids, right, Sudha?
Look, I think that Germany and Europe know there's no going back, right? We're not going to the status quo ante, but there is a need for some constructive thinking, because the United States and Europe still need each other. I think NATO has been a very successful alliance. No doubt that we will come out of this with a lot of damage. Trust is important for allies, and trust has been broken. But the United States also needs Europe for its force posture, and I think Europe can play up to that. So I do believe that Donald Trump is accelerating a lot of things that European policymakers and Germany has been aware of for the past 2 decades, right? So, he has caused NATO allies to spend more money on defense. And it's great if Europe and Germany can be a capable defense player in a conventional sense. These are all good things. This will make the transatlantic relationship stronger. But the damage in terms of trust is going to be hard to get back. There's not going to be an Obama bounce or a Biden bounce in 2028, no matter what happens. And I think it will be up to European policymakers and Germany to say that this relationship still needs to be pragmatic. We take the emotion out, but we need to converge where interests meet.
Okay. So I think we're almost at the end here, but I got to ask all of you, because I started with that. If you had to describe the relationship as it stands now in social media terms. You're familiar with all the terms. Okay. So what would you call it?
I would say evolving. I know that's very neutral. I probably won't get a lot of social media hits, but it's evolving. But
you've got to ask your kids what they say.
Exactly, right? Will they say cringy? I don't know. Is that what they would say? Cringy at times?
What do you say, Michaela?
In need of therapy, with no therapist in sight. I mean, it is abusive because, and I think that it really is in the midst of a huge struggle. And the overarching question, and I find it becomes more and more important, that I asked on day one when Donald Trump was elected, is how much of this is going to be reversible and what is irreversible. And in terms of NATO, it's fully reversible, like the damage that has been done so far.
So abusive and in need of therapy. And Teri, what do you say?
Oh, I would disagree a bit with Michaela that everything is reversible, but some good things have happened, as Sudha has mentioned. And I will say that the one thing that is mentioned at NATO all the time as a real game changer is Germany's defense spending. And we've alluded to it a bit. That's, of course, the subject of many shows. But Germany saying it wants to be the most capable army in Europe has really, really put Germany in a different light at NATO headquarters. As for the relationship, I mean, it's too easy to say it's complicated. Everybody throws everything under the it's complicated tag. Unfortunately, the U.S. is putting itself as single.
Single. Okay. But I do think we all agree that it is complicated.
And Europe is putting itself open to other alliances. Let's put it that way as well.
Okay.
You know, these
All right.
trade agreements.
Didn't Kala say yesterday that, war is like a relationship, easy to get into, but hard to get out of?
Right.
There you go.
Now you all going in the direction of an open relationship, but I'm not going to touch that now. Thank you for watching. This was Berlin Briefing for this week. Good to have you with us. Maybe we'll see you again. That would be lovely. Have a nice day.